Well, you probably don't know very much about this, but anything about the
Thank you everyone for being here. Sorry there was a couple minute delay, so I'll stop talking because you didn't come here to listen to me. Dr. Richard Ebeling is currently the BB&T Distinguished Professor of Ethics and Free Enterprise Leadership at Citadel College. Dr. Ebeling is also recognized as one of the leading members of the modern Austrian School of Economics. He has authored many books, including Foreign Liberalism and Austrian Economics and Public Policy. Dr. Ebeling is also a former professor of economics here at Hillsdale College, and he left in 2003 to become the president of FEE, which is the Foundation for Economic Education. I needed that for 5 years. Recently, he's also served as the president of the Society for the Development of Austrian Economics in 2020. Additionally, Dr. Ebeling's favorite economist/thinker is a very close race between Hayek and Mises. So either way, it's ended out on top. So without further delay, here's Dr. Ebeling's talk on why socialism will not bring freedom, prosperity, or equality.
Well, to begin with, it is a great privilege and honor to be back at Hillsdale College. I taught here for 15 years, 1988 to 2003. And I had wonderful students. I had great colleagues. You too, I guess. Maybe.
You should show that.
You should show it to him.
Jeez. God, I almost look the same. It's scary. Yeah, it's sort of like when you meet someone that you haven't seen in years, and they say to you, you know, you look exactly the same. Well, does that mean you still look as young as you did years ago? Or when you were young, you already looked that old? That's scary. But anyway, but it is great to be back here and to be talking about a subject like this. I had the again, the distinct honor for the 15 years I was here to be the Ludwig von Mises Professor of Economics. And the opportunity that gave me was to be able to talk frequently in my classes, both designated ones and in general ones, on ideas of the Austrian School of Economics, particularly Mises' contribution. And because of things that are happening in the world today, I would like to argue that there's going to be a renewed relevancy, particularly of the Austrian critique of socialism. So without ado, let me begin. America is in the grip of a serious counter-revolution against the ideas and ideals upon which this country was founded. Whether it concerns fears about the physical environment, or frustrations with the domestic economy, or charges of society-wide systemic racism, the presumption is that the problem stems from people having too much freedom, or if nothing else, the wrong types of freedom. The alternatives proposed to grapple with these problems all share a common premise. There is a need for greater government paternalism and planning over everyone's lives. For example, it is argued that the only serious remedy to the presumed danger from global warming requires national and international governmental restrictions, commands, and controls over how we work, how we live, and the forms and contents of our standards of living. The last 2 difficult years have been due to a government-created economic recession, resulting from lockdowns and shutdowns on production, employment, shopping, and traveling, as the political response to the coronavirus crisis. The sluggish recovery, especially in labor markets and in supply chains, have also been due to various government interventions. But it is now insisted that if more jobs are to be made available, if workers are to receive living wages and better work conditions, if goods and services are to be available in the face of the supply chain disruptions, and if income inequalities are to be narrowed, then there is only one answer: more government spending and more comprehensive government intrusions into how people work, on what terms, and in making which products. At the same time, America and increasingly various parts of Europe are facing an onslaught of a new brand of racism that rhetorically covers over what it is really about by insisting it is an ideology of anti-racism. To overcome the pervasive presence of an asserted systemic racism against all people of color, the call is made for government planning and regulating of virtually every form of human association inside and outside of the marketplace. Governments must determine the social and the financial just due for every politically designated and categorized racial, ethnic, gender, and social group in the country. Only future historians, who many decades from now look back at the unfolding events of this first half of the 21st century, will know whether these collectivist and political paternalist trends will succeed in triumphing over the social vestiges and cultural residues of the spirit of individual liberty and economic freedom in America and in some other parts of the world. But before becoming too pessimistic, it is worth remembering that the last 100 years have seen the ascendancy and seeming inevitable victory of several forms of philosophical collectivism and political paternalism, as seen under Soviet communism or Italian fascism or German National Socialism. Friends of freedom during those earlier years of the 20th century despaired of a coming twilight of what remained of any classical liberal ideas and social arrangements. And while the state has grown in size and scope over the last century, for most of this time, the leading Western nations successfully avoided falling into the abyss of a fully totalitarian collectivism. They have, at least until now, preserved degrees of the institutional prerequisites for still relatively free societies. But there is no doubt that with each passing year and decade, an understanding of the ideals derived from the classical liberal conception of a society of free people, based on a belief in the inviolable rights of the individuals to his life, liberty, honestly acquired property, and free association with any and all others for peaceful mutual benefit, has faded further out of the societal memory of each new generation. Perhaps this time, the tribal collectivists will succeed in destroying the remaining philosophical, political, and cultural ramparts protecting the residues of liberty. Nothing will be left but archaeological artifacts for those future historians to excavate and wonder how such a civilization built on the idea of the dignity and freedom of each and every individual human being have been ruined by a philosophical and ideological barbarian horde. But be that as it may, just like with the misplaced optimism of the political and economic collectivisms of the 20th century, the proponents of the Green New Deal and the identity politics tribal collectivism of the 21st century possess a confident belief that a climate-friendly and socially just society of the future requires the pervasive and heavy hand of government central planning. Unlike the collectivisms of the last century, it is again insisted that the planning hand of paternalistic government will assure greater freedom, prosperity, and equality, more than anything that had been possible under a more market-based economic system. Many of the advocates of the socialist theme in the 20th century insisted that government central planning was compatible with existing conceptions of personal freedom and civil liberties. There was no reason why government control and direction of the economy was inconsistent with the preservation of freedom of speech, freedom of the press, religion, assembly, and free association. Matching these under socialism would come newer and different freedoms they promised us, including a guaranteed job, a reasonable living wage, government provision of health care, retirement, a decent place to live, and equal access to the everyday amenities of life previously reserved for the privileged capitalist rich. A significant difference with our modern collectivists, who identify with identity politics, systemic race theory, and cancel culture, is the wide absence of any references to or calls for personal freedom or civil liberties in the Western traditional sense. Indeed, there is a frequent conscious rejection of the premises upon which they are based. For many aligned with this modern collectivism, there is an implicit and even explicit rejection of personal freedom and civil liberties. It is insisted that they have been and are a ruse to use language and justify actions inherently and inescapably racist. These people are a peculiar and perverse blend of Marxism and Nazism. They see society as divided into conflicting groups of oppressors and oppressed, capitalist exploiters versus all others in society. But replacing the traditional Marxist class analysis based on ownership or non-ownership of the means of production is a Nazi-like idea that what identifies and unifies people are their positions in different categories of social awareness and social status based on race and gender. The more radical versions of systemic race theory insist that no one can escape from their racial identity. It is who and what you are. White people are definitionally racist and oppressors of all people of color, whether they are aware of it or not. Being white gives you privilege by the biological necessity of the color of your skin. Just the same applies to all non-whites. Being non-white means you have been and are an oppressed people, regardless of how you as an individual, so classified, thinks about himself and has undertaken any actions attempting to have a distinct quality of your own. This means that the version of a socialist planned economy called for by identity politics and systemic race theory is inconsistent with freedom in two senses. First, if government is to plan the social and economic affairs of society, this necessarily abridges and abolishes those traditional notions of personal freedom and civil liberties. Both 19th and 20th century critics of all brands of socialism argued that by transferring control over the means of production from the private hands of individual owners who compete in the marketplace for consumer business and the hiring of employees to the singular hands of the government central planners means that people's freedom of choice as consumers and producers would be done away with. The government central planners would now determine and dictate what was produced in terms of quantities manufactured, along with their qualities and characteristics of what they considered to be socially necessary, desirable, and most important. Consumers would be supplied with what the political paternalists in charge of the ultimate planning decisions decided what the people really needed, not what those consumers might actually want to buy, as reflected in their demands for and purchases of competitively supplied goods and services in a free marketplace. Also, as the monopoly controller and planner of all production activities, a socialist government becomes the single employer for all those looking for work in society. Education, job opportunities, and locations of employment, along with the salary to be paid and any fringe benefits accompanying it, would be determined by the political authorities. The loss of or the leaving from one job leaves the individual still confronting the same employer anywhere he turns, the state. But the twist with identity politics and systemic race theory is that they deny even the illusion of desiring personal freedom. The 20th century socialists said they accepted and believed in civil liberties, even as they often de facto abolished them, and especially the communist regimes like the Soviet Union. But our new race-based tribal collectivist would-be planners reject even the rationale for personal freedom and civil liberties. All forms of racist and sexist thought and action becomes unacceptable as these political paternalist tribalists define it. There will be an officially approved and permitted system of language and action. Any verbal or physical expressions of forbidden speech and actions are to be expunged, with the accused banished from employment or any ability to defend himself or to participate in autonomous networks of human association. Hence, the accompanying role of cancel culture. Placing control and planning over the means of production in the hands of those in political authority means the end to individual liberty, freedom of choice, and voluntary association, as these ideas have been understood for well over the last 300 years. Defined by the new political paternalists in power, by some collectivist and tribal category of race, gender, and social status, the individual disappears as a thinking, deciding, and choosing human being. The individual's fate and fortune, from cradle to grave, is determined and dictated by those possessing and wielding the coercive planning powers of government. Our society has seen increasing instances of private organizations specifying, imposing, and policing the rules of political correctness in speech and action under the pressures of this new tribal collectivism. But it needs to be appreciated that it would be inescapable and universalized to the extent that greater degrees of governmental, social, and economic planning are introduced. The private sector exits to competitive alternatives still free from this ideology of neo-Nazism in the name of anti-racism would be limited or closed off completely. Each would find himself a slave to this new race and gender-based anti-racist totalitarianism. Now, wide and centralized government planning has long been identified with the name socialism. But many defenders of greater government control and command over social and economic affairs often insist they are not advocating socialism, because most of them do not call for outright nationalization and government ownership of the means of production. They too recognize and support the institution of private property and free enterprise, they say. But in the current global environment, the laissez-faire of the past must be superseded by government oversight, rules, restrictions, commands, and controls, guiding and directing how and for what purposes private enterprise will go about their business. There is, of course, another name for government command, control, and planning of social and economic life without direct government ownership of the means of production. It is called economic fascism. What is proposed in the name of fighting global warming, or for establishing race and gender diversity and inclusiveness, or greater racial and gender salary and status equity, is not strictly the Italian corporativist model of government mandated and directed cartels for all sectors of the market for pricing and production planning, but it comes closest to what is being proposed by many of the new proponents of economic planning. For example, the World Economic Forum that meets each year at Davos, Switzerland, sponsored a detailed white paper in September 2020 on how private businesses and corporations need to be reorganized and refocused in their structures and activities to meet the challenges of global warming and the need for greater race and gender equity. Corporations should set aside their archaic notion that their primary duty is to their shareholders and the making and maximizing of profits for these owners. They must view their essential duty to be to serve their stakeholders, those directly and indirectly impacted by anything and everything the private enterprise does, including, the white paper says, the quality and sustainability of the planet. Shareholders of the enterprise are to be viewed merely as one subgroup of claimants, deserving the recognition and reward from the activities of the private enterprise. Profitability, cost efficiency, and consumer satisfaction are all to be made secondary considerations to assure pay and promotion and decision-making equity within the firm. Socially aware wages and racial and gender employment balance will replace market-based hiring and remuneration for those employed and their place and role within the company. Corporations and other private enterprises that sign up to voluntarily follow the goals and targets of this new vision are to commit to introducing technologies and methods of production geared to reducing any and all carbon footprints. Quantitative goals are to be introduced to replace fossil fuel with renewable energy sources by specified dates. As the Davos white paper expressed it, quoting now, corporate global citizenship requires a company to harness its core competencies, its entrepreneurship, skills, and relevant resources in collaborative efforts with other companies and stakeholders to improve the state of the world. Stakeholder capitalism positions private corporations as trustees of society. Every participating enterprise submits itself to follow a centralized plan of changing what and how they produce and sell to be consistent with the target goals of what? The Paris Agreement on Climate Change. Each participating member is to be obligated to issue an annual report summarizing what they have done to fulfill the plan of zero net fossil fuel emissions by 2050. This includes explaining how they have brought their company closer into, their words, harmony with nature, to receive their sustainability certification from the association formed to represent, guide, and oversee the activities of all the participant companies. But besides the environment, all member enterprises are to directly take responsibility for the mental, physical, and social well-being of all people in their operations and value chains. Thus, every private enterprise is to be a provider of comprehensive welfare state services for all those within the firm, as well as all others in some way related to or affected by the company. Wages and other employment benefits must place priority on paying a living wage, and a wage sufficient to meet the basic standards of living and to lift households and communities out of poverty. Prices, costs, consumer satisfactions, market-based balances between supplies and demands for inputs and outputs lose all meaning. Like under Soviet socialist central planning, the Davos Model for economic fascism is simply to meet quantitative targets of input use and output amounts to reflect the climate change goals and the social justice benchmarks set by the United Nations and the umbrella organization monitoring and judging everything done by the private enterprise members. But beyond the voluntary membership and participation of any corporation and other private enterprise, the authors of the white paper see it as the basis of binding benchmarks, standards, targets, goals that might result in legal penalties if not successfully met and fulfilled. Thus, it becomes a short step from the voluntary to the politically compulsory. Certainly, this is what President Joe Biden is insisting upon when he commands that automotive companies meet production targets of so many electric-powered motor vehicles to be sold and on the road by 2030, or for regulatory plans to restrict other fossil fuel uses with the replacement by mandated wind and solar sources of energy. Now, once these steps are more fully introduced, and the economy is on the de facto economic fascist footing, all the Austrian criticisms of socialist central planning come into even more applicable play. By preempting or prohibiting market-based pricing and autonomous entrepreneurial decision-making about what and how to produce, and instead by imposing direct commands of output goals and production methods, the government central planners will undermine and then eliminate all remaining market rationality. Is production directed to what actual income-earning consumers desire? Are the scarce resources of the society employed and utilized based on their market-determined opportunity costs? Do owners of the means of production have market-guided incentives to creatively devise new and better ways and means of producing more and improved goods and services at lower costs to the benefit of the consuming public? The answers to these and similar questions under such a system of fascist-like economic planning is basically no. Resource use, production decisions, price and cost relationships will increasingly and in limit finally and completely be dictated by the central planning political paternalists. Based on what? Ideology and the special interest politicking in the corrupt give and take of democratic decision making. It becomes a political economy in the most pejorative sense. It will gravitate to what Ludwig von Mises once called planned chaos. The classical liberal and free market ideal concerning equality has been the idea of every human being considered to possess the same individual equal rights before the law. Equal individual rights to life, liberty, honestly acquired property in arenas of voluntary human association. However, an equality of rights carries with it an inevitable inequality of outcomes in terms of relative income shares and social status in society. But this inequality is not based on political privilege or favoritism arising from government protections, subsidies, or other regulatory or redistributive benefits. Market-based inequalities result from the value judgments of others in society about what they, as consumers and employers, consider to be our monetary worth in assisting in producing and supplying goods and services that our fellow human beings desire and are willing to pay for. The services of a brain surgeon usually carry a higher market value in the eyes of those needing a delicate neurosurgery than those same people or others see as the market value of a gardener or a salesman in a shoe store or even an economics professor teaching at a college. As the American economist Frank A. Fetter once said, in the free marketplace, every penny spent by a consumer is a vote, reflecting the buyer's valuation of the product bought, and therefore the worth of the services of those whose efforts have brought that product to market. The dollar votes that each earns tells every income earner what others directly and indirectly think their services to be and how they can render it in satisfying the wants and improving the lives of others. Therefore, some of those income earners have more dollar votes of income than others, which enable them as consumers to purchase more of what their fellow economic neighbors bring to market. But every one of those earned dollars has been brought about through the voluntary and mutually beneficial exchanges that go on constantly every day in a free market. Now, while the relative income shares in the marketplace are simply the outcome of a series of mutually agreed upon terms of trade in the free competitive process, once this process is politicized through government planning, pricing, and redistribution, it no longer possesses the rationality or the justice of a free society. With government determining what people earn and their access to various goods and services, the production and supplying of which has increasingly been decided upon by the paternalistic planners, there is reintroduced a society of privilege and favoritism. Power and pull, ideological pressures, voting bloc influences will now determine and decide what any individual may or may not earn. It would not be the individual's relative market worth that will be evaluated in the new world of identity politics and critical race theory. Instead, each person's absolute and relative income share will be politically determined for him as a member of a racial or gender or other collectivist group to which he has been assigned, based on the result of the rough and tumble of democratic realpolitik. One consequence will be that individual initiative and effort would be thwarted or would be redirected by government command or politicized incentives. This will have little or nothing to do with the use of talent, creativity, and entrepreneurial expertise in ways that actually serves the properly understood common good, which should refer to, and I would consider, to be the best fulfillment of consumer demands with constantly improving, least costly ways of supplying them. If fully or even partially implemented, such a new paternalistic planning model and scheme would lead to the same social and economic outcomes and consequences as the central planning experiences of the 20th century. The only question is whether it would be accompanied by the same reigns of terror and mass murders as was experienced under Soviet, fascist, and Nazi versions of socialism. Let us hope that future historians do not have to record consequences similar to those earlier ones. Thank you very much. And I know it's kind of wishy-washy and whammy-pammy, you have no idea where I stand on any of that. But, you know, I try to be fair. So, I've been told if there's any questions, comments, ruminations on the meaning of life? Yeah.
Broadly speaking, what does a free market solution to environmental challenges look like? Is it just a matter of information sharing?
Well, first of all, it all depends upon what you mean by the environmental challenges. Those people who I consider to be knowledgeable usually don't deny that the climate is changing. And that would probably be separate to whether or not there's a significant degree of human influence on or not. The fact that there have been ice ages and warming periods on this thing that we call planet Earth long before there were human beings and long before man was here, but before the Industrial Revolution. So then you have the question, if it is happening, and then any estimated degree to which it is happening, how much is unchangeable, since that's just the Earth doing its thing, even if there were no people on it, and how much may be due to what human beings are doing. Then the next thing is, let us suppose that you evaluate that there's some human effect. Well, what is the degree to it? Now, I'm sure some of you have seen this. A number of people have pointed out that, let's suppose that, we're wondering, what's going to be global GDP over the next, let's say, 100 years or so, if there was no global warming. And they have a line like this. It's supposed to be a 300% increase or so of global GDP over the next 100 years or so, assuming governments don't screw up everything more than they already do. So let us suppose that there is global warming and we do nothing about it, that we just live with it. And that means it's going to be like that instead. This is supposed to be like about 2%. So even if we do nothing, the negative effects of global warming would only reduce future GDP, looking at 100 years from now, by about 2%. I don't consider that a big thing. Whereas the other hand, if you follow the course that these people are advocating, obviously I'm not exaggerating, right? I haven't put any real scale here. It would be, the next 100 years, it would be something like that, or maybe even that. Well, I mean, they want us to ride bikes and walk, and we're supposed to give up eating meat because cows fart. I can't say fart, but that's okay. So, and then there's the issue is that how do you respond to this? How have human beings responded to environmental problems up till now? Well, people lived in cold areas, and what did they introduce? Central heating, after first having fireplaces. And how did they deal with heat? Well, they invented air conditioning after they had fans. How do we adapt to the fact that sometimes you have nothing but a sea front or an ocean front, and there can be negative effects from storms or hurricanes? Well, they built seawalls, or the Dutch built dikes. So the question is that even if there are these climate effects, they're not going to affect all parts of the world the same way, at the same time, to the same degree. And the decisions and responses should be decentralized to the particular location-relevant circumstances as they arise. And that should be left up to the market. I think that just as we expect other changing circumstances to be fulfilled by the market, if there are problems that people want solutions to, and if they're willing to incur costs to not have the inconveniences and the problems of them, profit opportunities are created, and you set the entrepreneurial juices loose, and people start finding ways to deal with them. A part of this is that if there are climate concerns, that would soon manifest itself in insurance rates and premiums. And to my knowledge, and talking to friends that I have in the insurance business, and I know that's not like a real scientific sample, but I asked them, do you notice that premiums are rising, in certain areas where they talk about, the sea is gonna rise, coastal land is gonna be flooded, homes are gonna be threatened with going up. They say no. Now, do insurance companies intentionally look for ways to lose money? No. And so that would be reflected in this, as well as property values. And that hasn't happened. And so I just believe that to the extent there is a climate problem, minus all the hysteria, it should be dealt with locally, decentralized, through market forces, where people decide trade-offs and costs worth incurring. And the world will be different. They say that at one time there were gardens in the Sahara and now there's desert. When that started happening, these planners would have stopped the Sahara Desert from occurring or something? And how would you have even done that? So I think that should be left up to the market, and the hysteria and hoopla, which I think is going to become awful, and if they follow through is going to really ruin our lives, because this is globalized central planning by networks of government agreement, if it were to be implemented, that we need to respond and understand this and deal with it a lot more calmly. Yes.
Yeah, so a lot of what you talked about reminded me of Hayek's sort of discussion of Scientism and that movement towards planning linked with Scientism.
Right.
And I was wondering what your thoughts are, maybe any optimism in that in the last 18 months we've seen a lot of people moving away from sort of trust in experts and sort of that kind of thing. Is there any gleam of hope against Scientism there or not?
I'm always a believer in not being too concerned about what seem to be inescapable trends. Ludwig von Mises once wrote an essay back in the 50s called "Trends Can Change." It's reprinted in his little book, Planning for Freedom. And he's basically saying there have been many instances where the trends seem to be occurring and seem to be inescapable and inevitable, and 9 times out of 10, the trend doesn't stay the trend, it changes. But he says that often what is required to bring about a stop, a slowdown, a reversal of what seemed to be an inescapable social trend is people of courage and integrity willing to speak up, write ideas, and oppose it. And that's crucial at this time. I do believe that you see these demonstrations and resistances around the world against shutdowns and masks and travel restrictions and so on. What I find bothersome is that however many of those demonstrations and critics there might be, the multitude of the populations of the countries of the world, including in the West, where there have been these residues of freedoms residues of elements of personal freedom, privacy, right of free movement and choice, just passively in lockstep doing what the government tells them to do. Actually, Professor Pongracic and I were talking about this earlier today. The world followed the Chinese communist model. It first started breaking out in China, and what was the regime's answer to that? Lockdowns, shutdowns, and draconian surveillance for everyone to stay at home. And in Chinese provinces with populations of tens of millions of people. And the rest of the world said, well, look, that's the model we have to follow. So you saw it in the European countries, you saw it in North America, you still see it in places like Australia. I mean, it's really locked down. I mean, some Australian advocates for freedom refer to their totalitarian regime. It's that passivity that is most bothersome. I mentioned, I don't know how many of you caught it when I was saying, is that one of my concerns is that while we've resisted totalitarian collectivism in our Western countries because our residues, our lingering elements of a tradition and the institutions of freedom, with each passing generation, an understanding and appreciation of the ideas and the ideals and the importance of freedom is diminished. And we have moved very far that way. I was mentioning in conversation, there's a word that you never hear or rarely hear referred to in contemporary political discussion, discourse, debate, and argument. You hear about equity and social justice and inclusion and diversity and freedom in the sense of free housing and free college and everything. But there's one word that has virtually dropped out of the political discourse and debate. I never hear it. The word liberty. See, liberty cannot be misused and abused in the same way as freedom has been. Liberty clearly means an arena, an area around the individual in which he has degrees of autonomy to live his life as he chooses, to say what he wants, act the way he wants, as long as he respectfully respects the rights of others the way others are meant to do with him. It would be absurd to say, I have the liberty to pick your pocket so I have a place to live, or I have the liberty to regulate you so you can't take away my customers. I mean, the word liberty still has that notion of the idea of the autonomy of the individual to control an area around his own life without restriction, as long as he respects the rights of others. And that's why the word liberty has fallen out of use, in my opinion. Because the collectivists can't adopt it in the same way, because the very meaning of it implies restrictions on either private individuals or governments telling you how to live your life. And if you won't do what they say, them ordering you to. And that's what I consider most dangerous. We need to reawaken both an understanding of and an appreciation of liberty, given that the word freedom has been so twisted. The same way the word liberalism was stolen and twisted earlier. Am I optimistic? I'm always optimistic. But it requires the efforts of those who value liberty to redouble their efforts right now. Any other questions or comments? Yes.
So, in regards to optimism that we might have, when looking at past historical examples, I don't know, the one that I usually get hung up on is the fact that while in the past, people can get together and stop, government from being overreaching, that kind of thing, with increasing, surveillance sort of states, like in China with, and, all sorts of, with the increase of technology allowing mass government surveillance of people, it seems like the ability for people to maybe turn direction from totalitarianism is becoming greater and greater diminished. I mean, how can that happen in, say, the 21st, or, what technology looks like and the ability of government to suppress people in maybe 50 years? Like, I mean, China's already scary in social credit scores and facial recognition. Like, I don't know. I want to be optimistic. Well,
Well, that was already anticipated and warned about in the late 1940s when George Orwell wrote his anti-utopian novel 1984. I mean, you have the anti-hero Winston, who works in the Ministry of Truth, which means all the information is retwisted to serve the current party line. But everything is surveillanced. There's security cameras everywhere. Even his attempts to elude it ends up being discovered, and then he gets caught and tortured. And finally, after his re-brainwashing sessions, he ends up loving Big Brother too. And it's clear to me that Orwell, who by the way remained a quote democratic socialist in spite of his understanding of the communist reality from his own experiences during the Spanish Civil War, left the novel closing on a despondent note. But my response to that is you never know what people will find as ways to get around these things. I said trends can change. You have to realize that things that seem obvious and can't be escaped from are escaped from. If we could go into a time machine to the year 1900, and you could read, well, what did people expect for the 20th century? People would have said, well, look at this 19th century. Greater freedoms, rising standards of living, respect for the individual, fewer wars, and the 20th century will be just like that. Well, 2 world wars, government control, I mean, that was a false anticipation. Fast forward to the 1920s and 30s. oh my God, it's the twilight of liberty. Soviet communism, Italian fascism, and then Hitler and Nazism. And then New Deal, or FDR and the New Deal, it's all over. You read, listen, I read a lot of these old books. Some of my best friends are dead people. I like reading these old guys. You see, that way they can never change their mind on you. Their last work was it. There's no revision. Oh, he changed his mind. But they're terribly despondent in the 1930s. They speak up for liberty and limited government and constitutional order, and they're trying to persuade and reason with their fellow man. Why do you write the books and articles otherwise? But they think that the end of liberty has come. Well, it didn't. And then everybody thought the Cold War meant the triumph of communism. There was a French social critic named Jean-Francois Rebel. And in the early 1980s, he wrote a book called How Democracies Perish. It appeared in English like about 2 years later. And he doesn't say it's the end of freedom, but it basically says the communists know what they want, and they have an ideal, and they're willing to die for it. We in the West, we're fat and lazy, and we don't even know what we believe in, and we wouldn't be willing to fight for it. Well, fast forward a few years, it's the Soviet Union that's gone. And so this seems like the new wave, these tribalists that I was referring to in my comments, which are really evil and dangerous. This is the worst ideology and streams of ideology that I've seen in my lifetime. And it is very disturbing. But, you never know what's going to happen around the corner that inhibits it, slows it down, stops it, prevents it from getting as bad as it otherwise could be, and gives you breathing space to keep fighting. So I think one of the most difficult things to predict is the unpredictable, and that's the future. Okay, any other questions or comments? I probably won't be back here for another 3, 4, or 5 years, assuming I'm still alive. So you better take your shot now. A student first, I'll get to you. Yes.
This is going to be a difficult question and a rather broad one, so I apologize.
I'm leaving.
because
I'm sorry.
And it's one of those questions that doesn't really have an answer, but I would still like to hear your 2 cents on it. Taking into account all this data, is there a solution that us students can take part in? Because it seems as though if you argued that you go into politics and you try to fix it from the inside out, it does more harm to you than you do good to it. And on the other hand, if you try to establish markets, eventually that's going to become eroded as well, because if the government continues in the way that it is, eventually you won't have the power to institute markets. So it seems to me as though there is no solution, and if we just choose to let things go as they are and hope that the trend will change and that some magical solution will just occur, that's not handling and stewarding our civilian status well. And it doesn't seem like there would be a solution under those circumstances.
I'm not calling for a policy or an attitude of passivity, quite the contrary. Actually, we were talking a little bit about this driving over here. Well, first of all, there's no central plan for liberty. A lot of people say, well, it must be in politics, or it must be, having seminars for young people. Or there's no central plan for liberty. First of all, you're here at Hillsdale College. I'm going to go out on a limb. You probably, to one degree or another, think freedom is important. I know, I'm wild and crazy, but sometimes you got to be that way. So that means that you think the ideas that you're learning here, or even perhaps already came here with, have value and importance to you, your life, and the rest of the people in this country and the planet. So that means that each and every one of us have to take a degree of burden and responsibility to try to fight the good fight. And that means that each and every one of us in our walks of life and corners of life have to try to influence opinion. Talking to family members, friends, co-workers, not rude, not discourteous, not being pushy, but to make the case when political discussions come up and have the courage and confidence and not letting the others set the terms of the debate to speak up. And you can't set aside how influential that could be. I'm going to give it, I know I'm talking too much and I apologize, but this is important stuff, I hope you agree. Let's suppose that you could go back in a time machine to the year 1883, and you went to a cemetery in London. You would see about a dozen people around a gravesite as someone was being lowered into the ground. And that person being lowered into the ground was Karl Marx. And half of the 12 or a dozen so people around the gravesite were his family members. See, this is some obscure, irrelevant person, 12 people, and half are his family. He's going to pass away and nobody will know. Let's suppose, hypothetically, that one person at that gravesite had been a young, true-believing socialist like yourself. Not that you're socialist, but young. Well, maybe you're a commie, I don't know. Subversive here at Hillsdale. But let's suppose that you were a young, true-believing, however we might consider naive socialist. What would be the world that he would have looked at in 1883? Great Britain or the United States? Look, it's capitalism everywhere. There's laissez-faire. Everybody believes in self-responsibility. Nobody believes the government should be doing these things. How can we ever win for the socialist future? Oh, it's a losing battle. But you see, what the socialists understood, in spite of their collectivist ideology, is that if they were going to succeed, you only do it one person in mind at a time. They argued, they debated. Remember, they had a different technology at the time, pamphlets, books, hall meetings where you'd hear a lecturer, right? No TV, no Facebook, no YouTube. But they understood that inherently, they understood the principle, it's one person at a time, one mind at a time. And so the fact is, a few decades after Marx was laid into the grave with that dozen people around the gravesite, Marxism is changing the world. Because for that young socialist in 1883, it would have seemed impossible. Free enterprise, limited government, low taxes, a spirit and philosophy and attitude of individualism. How are you ever going to teach people the truth of the socialist future that could be theirs? The other thing then is politics. Some of you may know that Hayek wrote an essay in 1948 called The Intellectuals and Socialism. And he says that you have to understand that the politics of today is the outcome of the political currents and trends of 20 or 30 or 40 years earlier. The climate of opinion slowly evolves and changes, and then politics reflects it. So in one sense, your job is to be changing the climate of opinion today in the ways I said, reasoning, arguing, discussing, debating, peacefully, courteously, politely, so that the climate of opinion can be different 20 or 30 or 40 years from now. Now, I'm going to be dead long before that, 40 years. But you'll be alive, and you'll be adults with your children, and you'll be concerned about your children's future, looking to the end of this century. So it is relevant and meaningful for you. All you could do in the politics of today is trying to support or endorse or vote for those who, however, ideologically are compromisers and people who don't really understand these freedom ideas, but who will do things for whatever reason to slow down the juggernaut. For instance, where there's a congressional election next year, the Democrats hold very thin margins above the Senate and the House. It is easily conceivable that one or two wins in the Senate or a handful of wins in the House could flip that for the Republicans. Now, I've been dumping on what would usually be considered people on the left today. These identity politics, and cancel culture, and all these other people. And I can assure you, I'd be willing to be as biting and as critical of many in the conservative movement for their compromises, their inconsistencies, and their cowardness. However, they're right now the only game in town in the pragmatic politics. I'd rather a Republican flip a seat in the Senate and to be able to stop Joe Biden from doing whatever nonsense he tried to do in the last 2 years of his term. Even if that Republican has no vision, understanding, or desire to reverse the garbage. At least it'll be slowed down from getting worse while the ideas can be at work to try to reverse it at some point in the future. So I think it's a little bit of both. And that's how I see it.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. Thank you, Dr. Ebeling, for answering our questions.
I'll just mention one thing, if anything I've said, either in my talk or the Q&A has not scared you. Yeah, oh no, what a nut. I do have a recent book, by recent came out a couple of years ago, called For a New Liberalism, which is an appeal and a case for a revival of a refined and better classical liberalism, politically, economically, and socially, and my arguments as to why it would be good and the dangers from the current trend. So that's in paperback, and you might find that interesting, For a New Liberalism. And it's published by the American Institute for Economic Research. Thank you.
Take it.